Welcome along, everybody. This is Punk Wars, a brand new 4X strategy game developed by an indie development studios called Strategy Forge SA and published in conjunction with them and JumboPixel. This is essentially set in a post-apocalyptic world where Steam, Steel, Atom, and Dieselpunk corporations, the four main factions, vie for conquest and glory. And I should note that this is a sponsored video. JumboPixel Games did sponsor this video and provide me with an early access copy of Punk Wars to playtest and review. However, all opinions are entirely my own. In fact, so much so, they didn't even ask to see this video before I've published it. Anyway, let's jump in and talk Punk Wars, and I can promise you these are my legitimate opinions after spending many hours with this game in what is, worth noting, an early access version. Indeed, the game releases a few hours after I publish this video. But let's talk about Punk Wars. What exactly is it? Why is it a 4X game? How is it different from existing ones? And ultimately, I'll try and give you some useful thoughts and opinions on the game so you can go out and decide if it's something you'd like to pick up and play yourself. So Punk Wars essentially has four key factions: Steam, Steel, Atom, and Dieselpunk corporations, respectively. There are a few different modes in the game. This footage that you're seeing right now is from the tutorial mode. However, there is also a skirmish mode, a lot like Age of Empires is a really good example to use that sort of structure of sort of a free-form sandbox skirmish mode. And then also there's a more substantive campaign mode as well, where you can choose one of those factions and set about, just like you would in any other 4X title, to win the game, whether it's peacefully through trade and diplomacy, or of course that more extermination-focused strategy of conquest that many of us have grown to love in 4X games. And like all other 4X strategy games, of course, we will have different yields to build and different units to use to try and capture those yields. You can see here, essentially, I have a small city with some walls, right? Some boundaries around it. The watchtower forms a center, and there are various districts that my builder units can build in and around my city walls, like, for example, as you can see here, training centers, which acts as barracks to train military units, but also, of course, resource extractors and all those kinds of things that we love from our 4X games. Of course, Punk Wars wouldn't be a true 4X game if it weren't for exploration. And I have to say, it does exploration really quite well. Before I really delve into the deeper details as we move through this review, looking at certain game modes, in-game events as well, which are a big part of Punk Wars and how they relate, in my opinion, to in-game resources, I'd like to talk a little more about those fundamentals, those fundamental things that make a 4X game great. And really the way that I did this at first was actually to jump into one of these, a skirmish mode. Here you can see the enemy settings, the map settings, difficulty, so on and so forth, if you're interested in those little details. So I jumped into a skirmish mode and a campaign mode afterwards and had a little bit of a play around with these features, just to try and really unpack this Punk Wars and see what it had to offer. I think that the exploration and city building features, particularly in these early phases of the game, obviously, are really quite special. I rather enjoyed exploring the map in ways that the game made it so distinct and such a distinct Punk Wars experience. For example, you've already seen my essentially Punk Wars style hot air balloon scouting ship already, and if you keep watching this video, you'll see a few other unique type of units that I think really help to shape the world building element of Punk Wars. Really one of its more unique factors. You can also see here some of the combat abilities at force. I've been able to use a special ability of my unit to restrict the movement of this unit and then carefully take it down the next turn. Indeed, units in Punk Wars can also level up. You can see here I've just leveled up my scout. With additional movement points, you can also get strength and action points and all sorts of other things. These fundamental 4X behaviors exist very much in Punk Wars, so too do research trees. And I was really thrilled to find out that each of the in-game civilizations, if you will, Steam, Atom, so on, have their own unique project research tree with unique outcomes, unique units. it really helps to feed into a more diverse 4X experience. For the more experienced players among us, I actually feel like a lot of the ways that this game handles combat in particular are quite akin to some of the formats and features of something like XCOM. Right? I mean, that example that I gave just before with my unit, before I jump into this skirmish mode here, I had a lot of interesting uses for my action points. It wasn't just move and click, but rather I could choose to stay here, fortify in my position, and also debuff the enemy with one of my debuff attacks. It's in that way I think that Punk Wars really delves into the combat mechanic as a particular strength. It's not just move your units to a tile and fire. It's not even bring a different type, say a recon unit that can fly over tiles where others would have to climb up and down the terrain. It's more than that. It's actually their unique abilities and functions that I think set them apart from other 4X titles which would simply look to move and click. And actually, the other thing, the final sort of gameplay element that I'd like to discuss here in this section of the video is around city settling and expanding. Here you can see, for example, and I love how on theme this is, as the Steampunk, my food district is a pigsty, right? And I jump into my tech tree and I'm looking to research things like, say, for example, junkyards, or indeed metallurgies as my first technologies. All of those things are so on theme, right? They're so on theme with my steel organization. And of course, the Atom Punks, as you've seen earlier in this video, have their own thing. All of the factions have their own thing, and I just love it. And of course, there is a Wastelanders faction who you can see giving me some grief here with their wonderful little steampunk unit. They are essentially the barbarians in this game. They will be irritating. They will come at you, so you'll need to have your defenses ready. But also you can see that what I'm actually fighting them over here is a city site. And this is akin to, probably, I mean, it's actually quite unique, but the thing that I could relate it to most closely is probably how city settling works in Old World. For those unfamiliar, in Old World there are city sites around the map, and you can sort of move over and claim them, and as I just skip through here, you can see, boom, here, this is what I'm talking about. This is a new city site. Not the site that I'm demolishing at the moment. I'm doing this just to scavenge for some resources, but the site next door, that sentry tower. If I send one of my civilians, like I'm doing here, over to that sentry tower, I'll be able to convert it into my own watchtower and start to build my own city around it, just like I'm doing here in my homeland, right? Capture the watchtower, turn it into one of my own, indeed bringing glory to my civilization, and then building up a second city around it. The watchtowers produce citizen units, and then of course I can use those units to build barracks and so on, or resource extractors, and spread the glory that is my machine across the map and into the great unknown. And of course there are scouts and various military units along the way that can help me do just that, but kabam! There it is, watchtower established, and my second city is online. I'm going to bring my gyrocopter over, and boom, my god, the gyrocopter is absolutely devastating. I think one of the actually other things that I've really enjoyed in my time that I've spent with Punk Wars is that because we're set in this post-apocalyptic setting, I think we have the best of both worlds, right? We have the fun exploration that comes from having a relatively open map, but also we have the fact that we're set actually after, I assume, current day technologies are in place, right? So we can explore a relatively barren map thanks to the post-apocalyptic setting, but still have some of those creature comforts. We don't just start having to figure out how to light a fire, for example. We start with access to a range of different weapons, technologies, vehicles, indeed, my beautiful gyrocopter, and all of those other great things that you would expect from having some experience with running a civilization already before the world turned to crap. That is my experience with Punk Wars. Let's talk now a little bit more about what it has to offer. Punk Wars, as I've said, does present us with a tutorial that is required to unlock some of the maps and modes in its second primary game mode, those skirmish modes, and then of course finally it has the campaign that you can see me playing now. The tutorial is not usually something I'm like to do, and I don't really like to be forced into playing them. However, credit where credit's due, it was actually quite a quick, snappy tutorial that taught me most of the things I needed to know, so shout out to that. It was actually relatively enjoyable. And of course, there are these events as well that you can see me grappling with right now. The events add a lot of actually interesting narrative-based dynamics into a game that already is well established to have a strong narrative, right? From that sort of factional division between, say, the steampunk and the steelpunk factions, or what have you. I think that the events do a great job at building up more of that narrative, and in my experience, I've noticed that they're largely based around resources, right? The impacts, the decisions that you make. Should we let these people in or send them out? Or, for example, another one I have was, should we let our people, for example, have breaks while they're at work? And of course, one side would have rewarded me with more manpower, the other side takes manpower away and impacts my overall happiness of the empire. Of course, there are other resources that I'm trying to manage as well, like food and water, and of course, those fundamental resources I need to build things too, as well as research. Overall, it covers off the resource yields really nicely, but I would have liked to seen those events be a little more impactful and dynamic. I also found that the UI around them, it wasn't explicitly clear in the early game as to whether I was accepting an event or foregoing other outcomes, if you know what I mean. Like, it felt like I was just sort of accepting this event, but I wasn't really sure what the trade-offs were. That could be on purpose, or it could be something that's coming in future. I'm not sure about the future development of the game, but either way, I just thought I'd point that out there, that as you can see, sometimes the events are easy enough to just kind of flick through without fully realizing what you're doing, so do read them carefully because their impacts matter. On the technical stuff, I think it's worth noting the game performed really well. I had no performance issues, no graphical issues in my hours spent in this somewhat still early access version. Of course, you'll be playing the release version on Steam tomorrow if you choose to pick up the game. And finally, I think this really draws me into my closing remarks for this video. I'd like to again give a shout out to the developers for providing me with a copy and sponsoring this video. I greatly appreciate it. I won't therefore be providing a generic should you or shouldn't you buy it. I wouldn't want you to think that the sponsorship got in the way of my ultimate opinion or perspective on this game. However, I hope that throughout this video you've gotten a good taster for Punk Wars, for what Punk Wars can offer, and hopefully you're determining whether it's the right experience for you. I should note that Punk Wars is an indie game and is therefore releasing at a relatively cheap and easily accessible access point. Punk Wars is, I believe, retailing at around $15 US, making it a cheap indie experience in the wonderful 4X world, and honestly, I can seriously say that I would pick it up and play it myself if I wasn't treated to this early access version. In fact, I might just go and play a little bit more now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.